Here is a sheet that has an overview of the content part of this week's lesson or module, week 4. Think about it, 4 out of 7, that means we're halfway through. And maybe even more than that, because the last week I'm going to focus on your exam, your book report, not book report, your book list, and your journal. Speaking of your journal, you should be entering things along the way as far as the books you read. Also, keep in mind that there are some special additions you need to put in there, and it will help this week with the illiteracy part. It has some articles that will give you benefits of reading, and that's one of the journal entries you'll need. Speaking of your book list, I ask you this week to just give me an idea of how many books you have on your book list so far. The reason I'm doing that is to keep this in front of you. I know you have many other things going on, but I still need to remind you to be working on this so that you don't save it for the last minute. So please be working on your book list. Keep that in mind. Let me know roughly how many books you have on your list right now. And that will be an email that you send to me with your feedback. Okay, when it says insert link here, that's because I'm going to figure out how to put this on the internet, and I will put the link there so that when you open the file, you can go there. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay, last week, if you look at your adolescent literature overarching concepts, we've talked about definitions, resources in adolescent literature, history. We were on Roman numeral 4, trends, and we had A, trends in adolescent literature. There were 6 of those. Trends in teaching adolescent literature. There were 7 of those. And so this week we'll talk about trends in reading, and that's illiteracy. So this week we'll finish up with a trend in reading illiteracy. That's going to be a separate section on a YouTube video. I don't know which link works. Hopefully one of them will. If not, please let me know. The next part won't take that long, I hope. Okay, one of the things we also want to promote is higher level thinking. And hopefully our dear friend Benjamin Bloom comes to mind. Did you know he was not the only one? It's not just Benjamin Bloom, it's just of all the people that worked on this project, when they put them alphabetically, his name was first, and so it's known as Bloom's taxonomy. There are 3 different taxonomies. Actually, there are many taxonomies, but when you talk about Bloom's taxonomy, there is the affective domain, like do you like things, all right? Your affections comes from the same root. There's the cognitive domain, that's the one that we always talk about and focus on. And then there's, I don't know if it's called psychomotor or whatever, but there's that domain as well. I mean, it's in books worth long. But we can distill it to a page or 2. And the reason it was very popular back when I was in school. We had to learn all 3 of them. Now it seems like there's been a resurgence because people are using it to promote higher level thinking, higher order thinking. And I am such a whiz at getting these files and putting them in there, and I tried to alphabetize and code them, and you can see that we have 2 E5s, one with a capital letter, one with lowercase. So I'm sorry about that, and I can't even figure out how to change it to make it right. But anyway, the one you have with Bloom's taxonomy, that's E4. That's the old one, but the reason I left it in there is because of the verbs that are associated with that. I actually didn't mean to put it in there, but since it's in there, for what it's worth. Okay, number 5, E5, applying Bloom's taxonomy. Again, this is using the old Blooms, which many people still are using the old Blooms just because there's so much out there with it. But notice the useful verbs, notice the sample question stems, and I just think that a sheet like this is very helpful for days to come down the road. I think you will find that helpful. Okay, but notice all the stars by capital E5, Bloom's Taxonomy Revised. I don't know why they revised it. Seemed fine to me. It doesn't seem like it's earth-shaking as far as the changes that they've made. But instead of knowledge, we have remembering. Instead of comprehension, we have understanding. And, well, I guess the one difference is instead of nouns, they're all listed as verbs. So instead of application, the noun, you have applying the verb. Instead of analysis, the noun, you have analyzing the verb. And they've switched the top two. Synthesis would, of course, be creating something. So they've got creating at the top and then evaluating. Instead of being at the top like the old Blooms, they've got evaluating as, what is that, fifth? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, fifth. Okay, I do want you to know these. This is rote memory. I will ask you to know these. I want you to know them. When I was writing lesson plans as a high school teacher, we couldn't list our objectives as know something. They couldn't know something. We had to use a verb that was something other than know, where they demonstrated something. It had to be behaviorally stated, that they wrote 6 out of 10 or something like that. So anyway, Bloom's Taxonomy, especially E5, capital E5, Bloom's Taxonomy Revised. Know the new blooms. Okay, and then E7 is Bloom's Taxonomy Questions, and again, we've got old Blooms listed. All right, they've used old Blooms, but again, I think these are very helpful, especially for a literature teacher. I think it's great. So anyway, we're trying to promote higher order thinking. Ask questions that also do that. You still need to make sure that they've crossed the first and the second stages. They need to remember, they need to understand before they can do anything. So, you know, the first two steps are very important, but you do want to press them to go higher. Which leads us to the next two categories. I'm not going to hold you accountable. These are in the for what it's worth category. It used to be, in the early days of adolescent lit, we drilled to kill on literary terms. And the feedback that I've received is that you have this in many other literature classes. And so I stopped doing that. But I do want to have this before you in the sense that on your praxis, I noticed when I was just looking at what they require you to know, they do ask to a certain extent literary terms, and this might be something that you would look at before you take your praxis. Some of them I'm sure won't be on there, but some of them are very common. And the idea with literary terms is you want to appreciate the author's craft. Again, you just sometimes will take an abstract concept, and because of literary terms, for instance, a simile or a metaphor, they are making it concrete when they use a literary term or one of these devices. Possible things in themes in literature. Again, this is just something that I made up one time, sat down and brainstormed. I don't know of any list of possible themes in literature, and since I've done this, there of course are many more that could be added, but it's a start at least. You want students to identify the themes. You don't often get a book, and I hope you don't have a book where it says the theme of this book is loyalty or something like that. Okay, that's usually what you infer from the plot. So, but there are students who have a hard time figuring out, well, what is the theme? And so maybe having a list like this to look at would be beneficial. Another thing is, and we talk about when we talk about poetry later on, we'll talk about maybe making a poetry notebook, and sometimes students will organize them around a theme, and they might need something to jumpstart their thinking, and so you could choose several of them and say, okay, you know, we need to have a poetry notebook. Here are some possible ideas. I don't know that I would ever give a classroom of especially middle school students, something like this. I don't know if they'd know what to do with it. But anyway, you are not accountable for this. I won't test you over this or the literary terms, but I just thought it might be something that'd be nice to have in your file. Bloom's taxonomy, you need to know. Okay, finding books. I'm going to look back, and I would encourage you to look back on your adolescent literature sheet that has the overarching concepts. We've talked about definitions, resources, history, trends. This is Roman numeral 5, or that was Roman numeral 5, literary terms and themes, and they promote higher level thinking. Okay, now we are starting Roman numeral 6, which you notice is pretty long, but we're just going to do letter A under books. And letter A is finding books. And I don't have a fancy razzle-dazzle handout or anything. I just have 2 points underneath the overarching concepts under Roman numeral 6, letter A, books, finding books. 2 things to keep in mind. One is gender and the other is age. Gender, guys versus girls, okay? The principle is, all right, the generalization is girls will read books about girls or guys with the main character being, the protagonist being either a guy or a girl, and they won't think much of it. A guy, on the other hand, will usually choose a book where there is a guy as the protagonist, the main character. You don't usually see your typical middle school kid or high school kid reading Jane Eyre or books by Jane Austen. Not usually. They have to be pretty bookish and interested in the classics to do that. And that might be something to keep in mind as you work on your book list. Make sure that the protagonists, the main characters, are a good mixture of guys and girls. When I first taught adolescent lit, first couple years, I just had girls in the class and really didn't pay much attention to the books I chose. And then I looked at my class roster for, I think it was the 3rd year. I had 2 guys and 1 girl, and I thought, you know what? I got to rethink the books that I'm choosing because all of the protagonists, other than the giver, they were girls. So I had to rethink that. So, and also I mentioned this to that class, and one of the guys said, yeah, he doesn't even like to read books that are written by girls. If it's a female author, he usually will put the book back. Now that is a little extreme. I don't know that that is a truism across the board, but the generalization is guys will read books where the guys are the main characters. Girls, doesn't matter as much. Age-wise, kids will choose books where the protagonist is their age or older. Their age or older. Now, with a biography, usually they start younger and then advance to adulthood. So biographies are kind of an exception to that. But for the most part, age-wise, they'll read about someone who is their age or older. So you have to keep that in mind as you are suggesting books to students in your class. Okay, there are 2 documents, and I'm going to run out of time. I'm watching the time here. One is a reading interest inventory. This is a helpful tool to have on file so that you know what kinds of books your students would like. There are many of these. This is just something I've compiled. I used to have one that was like 4 pages long, and I'd give it to them the first day of school while I was passing out books, but that's just overwhelming. But something like this is a useful tool. Rager is in here just because I mention it. But instead of figuring out the readability of a book, I would look at Amazon or Barnes & Noble and see what they recommend. Or if you're desperate, scan it into a computer, look at the word icon where it gives you the level of reading for a book.